Before I begin, I'll just give you a wee trigger warning, as there is some strong language in this episode. In this episode, I speak to one of our listeners, Stephen, who recommended we cover this story. Stephen, who is from Edinburgh and has visited Tron Square, where the murders took place, has done a lot of his own research into this case, and the murderer, George Alexander Robertson. However, he also has a connection with the case, as his Aunt Jessie was friends with one of the victims, Jean Robertson, and had actually been out dancing with Jean on the evening of the murders. However, this is not the only reason Stephen began researching the case and asked for us to cover it on the podcast.
As I say, it's just a story that every now and then it'll come out in Edinburgh Live or Edinburgh Evening News, even the Scotsman. And when you read it, you always kind of a lot more to it. And I think that's why I started digging into the story of George Robertson. I just think it's an interesting story. And I've told a few people in the pub, and hardly anybody knows about it. Came part of Edinburgh's history. I find it quite interesting, came for what he done, his state of mind that he must have been in. His laddie was his blue-eyed boy, if you like. And what happened last summer, me and my partner, Cindy, were up the Royal Mile, and you just walk down a close, and you're into the Tron Square. And we went down and we started talking to a woman down there. We started talking about the murder, and she had stayed there for 27 years. But people that had stayed there, a lot of them that are older didn't like talking about the murder. That's why I wanted this sort of story put out there.
This story is about George Alexander Robertson, his ex-wife Elizabeth McGarry, and their two children, George Jr. and Jean. And in February 1974, Elizabeth, George Jr. and Jean were living at 57 Tron Square in Edinburgh. Here's Stephen to tell you a wee bit more about where Tron Square is and what the area would have been like back then.
Tron Square, it looks like an open prison when you're actually in it. When you're in the courtyard, that's what it's called, the courtyard. It used to look straight onto the Cowgate, or the Cowgate as we call it. It looked right onto the Cowgate. You just walk down a close and you're into the Tron Square. And it's no far from the Royal Mile. It's 50 yards or something and you're into Tron Square. There's actually two squares. There's one at the top and one at the bottom. And it happened at the bottom one. Edinburgh was very populated then in the Old Town and the south side. And it was a very, very populated area. It would have been a rough old place. And back then, the council done all the place up because, see, if you try to find out the numbers now, they changed all the numbers on the doors in Tron Square. The only way in the photo that I took was the photo for the paper, and from Elizabeth McGarry's house to the Hayes house, coming down the stair and with the bloody footprints and that. I'm not saying it was a bad community. The man at Jessie says that. She says, oh, the place was spotless. Everybody took their turn to clean the stair and whatnot. People had a wee bit of pride in where they stayed. The Cowgate, the Canning Gate, behind the playhouse. That was all just tenements. Everything's away. And they're all knocked down now. It's like there's a lot more space. But back then, everybody just sort of crammed in all together. It's quite a strange, but you could walk past somebody's window, but you'd be at hip height with their windowsill. When you're walking past, the windows are very low. And the ones at the back, the windowsills are only about 2 feet off the ground. But it's all fenced off now, you can't walk in, but back then you would have been able to.
Like I said, the story is about 40-year-old George Alexander Robertson, his ex-wife 39-year-old Elizabeth McGarry, and their two children, 18-year-old George Jr. and 16-year-old Jean. Before I get into the story, let's find out a bit more about the murderer and his victims from Stephen.
Elizabeth, she used to work in the rubber mill in Fountain Bridge when they got married. So she had a job there. Young George, he was a coal carrier. That was a heavy job. Here and all the coal about and whatnot. So Auntie Jessie, she's a nice lad in that. He's got to do his national service, maybe join the army and make a career out of that. I think young George, he went to St Patrick's School, which is in the Cowgate. And then he went to St Tam's at St Chambers Street. He went to that school. I don't know how he done at school, but he never had a chance in life because of his dad, which I thought was brutal. Jean wasn't a very well girl. My Auntie Jessie was telling me she suffered from TB, and I think she missed a lot of her schooling through it. George Alexander was a safe breaker, but he used to remove the safes. he used to take them out of the place, and I was doing a bit reading about him there, and he robbed a shop of 21,000 cigarettes in Bowness. He got 3 years for that. In Edinburgh Evening News on 28th of June 51, stole car went out on bail for stealing the cigarettes. But I was talking to Manic Jessie yesterday. She was saying there was 3 families. There was no probably more, but there were 3 families with their men in prison in that wee skin in the Tron Square. But remember, Don, that was it wasn't even 10 years after the end of the war. People had fuck all, eh? They had now, and you just had to survive. What Manic Jessie says to me yesterday was that you come from a good family, quite a nice area, Edinburgh. You come from a good family, kind of, wasn't it? It was a family thieves or whatever, eh? Kind of come from a good family. But she says he was fine when he was here, but I think he had only been there a short time after he got out of jail. Because when you look at his prison sentence, he got 3 years in 51, and then he got another 6 months on that for stealing the car. And when he got out, and then he's got back in touch with his ex-wife, and she was away for her second husband. They never ever got divorced. I don't think it was a very successful marriage, or what you read with stuff like that, a second marriage. But a single mother with 2 young children, again, back then, you never had welfare state or whatnot. Again, you couldn't go up and just say, give me some money or no money. It didn't work like that, eh? Came back then. So I don't know if she just got married for the security with the children. But Annie Jessie never really mentioned that. But all she really mentioned was she seemed like he was fine. This is what I get about it. And when you look into the story, everybody says he was a decent guy. But what pushed him over the edge? Was he mentally ill? And had he been pushed over the edge? I think it's a very interesting story how somebody's mind can be so fucked up, if you like, and to go through all that.
According to an article in the Edinburgh Evening News on the 2nd of March 1954, George Alexander Robertson and Elizabeth Gregg married in 1934 at St Patrick's R.C. Church in Edinburgh when he was 20 years old and Elizabeth was 19. At the time of their marriage, as Stephen said, Elizabeth was a rubber worker and George was a coal merchant, and the pair lived in Guthrie Street in Edinburgh. 2 years into their marriage, the pair welcomed their son, George Jr., and 2 years after that, Jean was born. The marriage sadly was not a happy one, with George Robertson becoming violent, aggressive, and he was extremely jealous, with it being reported in an article in Secret Scotland that at times the only way George said he could make Elizabeth see sense was to bind her, gag her, and threaten her with a hatchet. After 14 years of marriage, the pair divorced, and George left the family home, now at 57 Tron Square in Edinburgh. All seemed to settle down, and Elizabeth even married again, although this marriage was very short-lived, and she and her husband split up, although they did not divorce. As Stephen mentioned, George Sr. had been in and out of prison, but upon his release in early 1954, he returned to the home he had once shared with his family, and Elizabeth, perhaps being lonely and hoping George had changed, allowed him back into the home. Although this was very brief, as a few weeks later Elizabeth called the police and asked them to remove George Sr. from the home. Elizabeth, George Jr. and Jean were scared, with George apparently not having changed his behaviour. It was at this point, when police were being asked to remove George Sr. from 57 Tron Square by Elizabeth, that Jean had alleged to the police officers that her father had had intercourse with her, and had been doing so for quite some time. George was then removed from the home at 57 Tron Square, and he went to stay with his mother, which was about an 18-minute drive away from Tron Square. George had stayed with his mother previously on being released from prison each time, and his mother and their neighbours noticed a marked change in his demeanour from those times to this time, with one of George's mother's neighbours saying, according to an article in the Edinburgh Evening News on the 2nd of June 1954, that George was normally a cheerful and happy type, but that in the fortnight from being removed from Tron Square to the tragedy happening, he had seemed worried and didn't want to talk. Back at 57 Tron Square, though, while Elizabeth, George Jr. and Jean felt slightly more relaxed and not as fearful all the time by George's presence and were able to carry on with their lives, there was still an element of fear present in their lives of George Sr.'s return, as each evening they had now taken to bolting their door and jamming a chair under the doorknobs, as well as placing a poker at windows or within reach, just in case he came back. And they were right to be worried, as George Sr. would come back on Sunday the 28th of February 1954, 2 weeks after being removed from 57 Tron Square by the police. The evening of Saturday, the 27th of February, had gone like any other Saturday. George Jr. went out with his friends, Jean had gone dancing with her friends, and Elizabeth had had some of her friends over to her flat. As the night wore on and Jean and George Jr. came back home, the group gathered in the flat, had a wee sing-song before Elizabeth's friends left, and Elizabeth, Jean and George got ready for bed. However, in their merry mood, they forgot something vital. Something they had religiously been doing since George Sr. left 2 weeks prior. They forgot to put a chair under the doorknob or have a poker to hand. And it just so happened that it would be this night that George Alexander Robertson Sr. would make his way to the flat at 57 Tron Square and be pleased to find his access unbarred. Sometime around 2 a.m, George Alexander Robertson broke into the flat at 57 Tron Square, where his family lay sleeping peacefully. Jean first became aware of her father being in the home when she awoke to him whispering to her mother to go into the kitchen. Jean then woke her brother, and her brother, followed by Jean, went into the lobby. But their father was there, and Jean saw her father sticking a knife in George Jr.'s head. George Jr. then fell to the floor in the lobby, and George Sr. moved past his son lying on the floor and came at Jean, pushing her back into the bedroom and onto the bed she shared with her mother, before stabbing her in the stomach and on the arm. All the while, Jean screamed in terror. Jean then heard the outside door of the flat open, at which point her father rushed out of the room towards the outside door. It would appear whatever had happened to Jean's mother in the kitchen, Elizabeth had still been alive and had enough strength to make it out of the flat in search of help. However, sadly, she wouldn't make it very far before her husband, George Robertson, caught up with her. While their father was distracted by their mother leaving the flat, Jean had gone to her brother, who by this time had made it to a chair in the bedroom. He was severely wounded and begged Jean to go and get a doctor. Knowing she couldn't get out the front door as she was likely to encounter her father and mother, Jean began to tie 2 bed covers together, after which she hanged them out of the bedroom window, intending to climb down. However, she wasn't able to do this, as she was unable to use her left arm, following her father stabbing her. By this time, her father was now back in the flat, carrying his ex-wife Elizabeth over his shoulder. Unable to get out of the flat, Jean went into the kitchen where her father had taken her mother, and she saw him roughly throw her to the kitchen floor beside the cooker. Jean saw that her mother now had a big hole in her stomach, and that she had possibly a hanky tied around her mouth, and that her hands were bound. At this point, Jean's mother was not moving. Seeing Jean standing there, George quickly grabbed her and put tape around her mouth and tied her hands using flex. He then took her waist slip off. At this point, Jean said she then heard a window being smashed in another flat nearby, and her father again ran out of the flat to investigate. It turned out that George Jr. had managed to escape the flat, despite his wound, and had made his way to a nearby ground floor flat. Remember, Stephen had said that the windows in the ground floor flats at Tron Square were strange because they were very low to the ground. Well, upon George Jr. making it from his own flat, he smashed a downstairs flat's kitchen window and jumped through, likely hoping to raise the alarm and have the police called before his father could do any further harm to his family. However, sadly, George Sr. was hot on George Jr.'s tail, with him too having followed George Jr. through the broken kitchen window into Mr. and Mrs. Hayes' flat. According to an article in the Edinburgh Evening News on the 1st of June 1954, Larry and Catherine Hay and their 2 young children were in bed asleep when there was a loud bang at their door, followed shortly after by breaking glass. As Larry and Catherine bolted from their beds, they said they could hear young George shouting to Larry, saying, "Larry, Larry, he's here, my dad, Larry, my dad." By this time, Larry and Catherine had reached the kitchen door, in time to see George Jr. throwing himself through the window, covered in blood, and George Sr. was just behind him, also coming through the Hayes kitchen window, wielding 2 knives. Before the Hayes could do anything, George Jr. fell to the floor, and his father, George, had stabbed his son a further 3 times with both knives. By this time, both of the Hayes' young children had also left their bedrooms to see what was going on, and before being ushered back to the bedrooms, they saw George Sr. stabbing his son. Larry Hay then tried to get George Sr. away from his son, but George Sr. turned on Larry and told him, "You keep out of this, or you will get it too." The Hayes then said that George Sr. briefly left the flat, while they both just stood in shock at the now not moving George Jr., before George Sr. then returned and looked down at his son sadly and said, "That's all through that woman up there, but she has got what she deserves." George Sr. then asked Larry to help him lift George Jr. off the ground, and then George Sr. put his son over his shoulder and left the flat. In a state of shock, the Hayes just looked at each other in disbelief. Before they had a chance to check on their children or go and get the police, George Sr. returned once again, still carrying his knives, but he had them in his hip pockets this time, and he asked the Hayes for bandages. At this point, George Sr. told the Hayes that Jean was still alive, but if they went to the police, then he would finish Jean off, and then himself. Despite this threat, once George had left their flat, Larry and Catherine did go and alert the police at the nearby police station. Back in the upstairs flat at 57 Tron Square, Jean was still alive, but was bound and gagged in the kitchen. Jean's mother was also bound and gagged on the kitchen floor, and Jean's brother, George Jr., upon being brought back to the flat by his father, was put down on a chair, before George Sr. then turned to Jean. He took her from the kitchen and threatened to kill her if she caused any trouble, as well as apparently making reference to the complaint that Jean had made to the police about him having had sexual intercourse with her. Apparently then, concerned for his ex-wife and son, George told Jean to get hot water, as he planned to revive both Jean's mother and brother with whiskey and water. Upon Larry and Catherine Hay arriving at the local police station at 2:37 a.m. in a distressed state, 4 police officers immediately made their way to Tron Square, where they found bloodied footprints coming from the upstairs flat of Elizabeth McGarry's flat to the Hayes flat at number 42. They found a broken kitchen window and lots of blood, and so the police officers made their way cautiously to number 57, where they knocked on the door and shouted. However, there was no answer, although they could hear someone moving inside. The 4 police officers then opened the door to the flat of number 57 and made their way in, where, according to the Edinburgh Evening News on the 1st of June 1954, first they saw blood-stained clothes strewn over the floor and blood-stained bed-sheets hanging out of the window. They then saw George Jr. slumped on an armchair in the sitting room, with a puncture wound to his head, a gaping wound behind his left ear, and a wound on his forearm. Then, making their way into the kitchen, the police officers saw the body of Elizabeth McGarry lying next to the cooker, wearing only a brassiere, but covered by a brown coat, and there was a lot of blood. Jean was sitting on the kitchen floor with adhesive tape round her neck and her hands tied together with flex, dressed in an overcoat with wounds to her abdomen and her arm. And then they saw George Alexander Robertson lying on the kitchen floor, unconscious, with his head inside the gas oven. The officers immediately turned off the gas, removed George Alexander Robertson from the oven, and secured him with a piece of flex that was lying on the floor before he was arrested and charged. Sadly, Elizabeth and George Jr. were already dead, but Jean was rushed by ambulance to hospital. Jean did survive, but remained seriously ill in hospital for some time. She did, however, give evidence at her father's trial. But before we get to the trial, here's more from Stephen about just how close his Aunt Jessie came to staying the night at 57 Tron Square the night of the murders, about another relative that was there that night, and what his thoughts are so far about the murders, why he thinks George might have carried out the murders, and what others thought of George before and after the murders were carried out.
My Auntie Jessie was meant to stay there that night, and she never, but my great granny that stayed in number 39 Tron Square. She was blind, and I don't know if she had a sixth sense, but I was talking to my Auntie Jessie yesterday, and she's saying that night she had a guardian angel because she always stayed with Jean Robertson after they had went to the dancing at the weekend. But my great granny kept saying to her, come home. And my auntie, my dad's sister, she says, oh, for fuck's sake, Jessie, just take a key. Can't you stop her moaning and come home? And she did come home, but if she hadn't, she would have been in the house that night. My uncle, he was a train driver, and he had finished a shift. I think when he was walking in Tron Square, I think it must have happened because he come in and says, there must have been something happened. He says, the Billy Police down there, eh? So, and that's what it was. He had killed his wife and his son. The fear that he must have had to run out his house and then jump. As I says, the windows are very low. You wouldn't really need to jump, you just need to push yourself through the window. It'd be lower than the height of a table, if you like, and you just need to push yourself through it. But even to do that, you're in a state of fear. Your dad attacking you, be nice and that. And God knows what was going through his head when he was running down the stairs and just wanting help. The guy in the house, Mr. He must have been shiting himself. But I often wonder what happened to them and their family and that. If they still talk about this stuff, and this is what happened to my mum and dad when we were there. That'd be 70 years ago. February, 70 years ago this would happen. So if they were still living, they'd still be maybe under 80 or whatever. As I says, when we met that woman, and she was just sweeping her steps round about her house, and I says, I remember the council used to do that. Says, they bugger all now, and just started talking away, and we just started talking about the murder. People still talk about it down there, that know about it. And but she says, there's one or two of them didn't like talking about it. It happened, you can't change it. But there's one guy that says he never meant to kill his laddie. Well, I had been researching this, and I went, he didn't mean to kill his son, because he stabbed him 14 times. He chased him through a broken window, and like say, she had tied the bed sheets together to try to escape out the window. So, he did mean to kill his son, but you've still got people that stay down there that are saying, no, I never meant to kill his boy. But Auntie Jessie says that she doesn't think that the dad had done anything to her, because they were really pally and that, and she thinks it was just she didn't want her dad about. I don't know what it was like inside their house, in the domestic violence and whatnot, but like say the guy I was talking to in London about 15 years ago that sent me the email, he says he was a nice man. He said he was always pleasant, and even Auntie Jessie says that he was always polite and nice, but obviously you didn't care what happens behind closed doors. And how people will say, can he be such a lovely man? See, I think George Robertson, he just cracked. I don't think there'd be anything worse than getting called what he was, that he tampered with his own bairn. As I say, Manny Jessie, he must have been in the house when he was there, and he says that he was fine. There was nothing like that, but obviously we didn't do that when you've got an audience.
OK, so the trial begins on the 1st of June 1954 at the High Court in Edinburgh, and despite only lasting for 2 days, 39 witnesses were called, including Jean Robertson, Larry and Catherine Hay, George Sr.'s mother, Elizabeth's sister, and medical experts, as well as 46 productions of evidence being presented in court, including, according to the Edinburgh Evening News on the 1st of June 1954, medical reports, photographs, fingerprints, a sheath knife, a boning knife, a stick, a poker, a rolling pin, clothes, and pieces of flex. But before we get to the trial, this was what George Alexander was charged with. According to the Edinburgh Evening News on the 1st of June, George Robertson was charged that, on the 28th of February 1954, in the house occupied by Elizabeth Gregg, or Robertson, or McGarry, at 57 Tron Square, Edinburgh, he assaulted her, tied her wrists with a piece of flex, bound her mouth with adhesive tape, and in the house in Tron Square repeatedly stabbed her with a knife until she died. Also in the house at 57 Tron Square, and in the house occupied by Larry Hay at 42 Tron Square, he assaulted George Alexander Robertson Jr., his son, and repeatedly stabbed him with a knife and murdered him. As well as at 57 Tron Square, he assaulted Jean Elizabeth Robertson, his daughter, tied her hands with a piece of flex, bound her mouth and legs with adhesive tape, and repeatedly stabbed her with a knife, and attempted to murder her, and did previously demonstrate malice and ill will against them all. Interestingly, though, George lodged no special defence. He willingly admitted to the murders and attempted murder, and he didn't want a trial. We'll find out later why not, as George would not let his annoyance at having to stand trial go, even asking the judge to speak on the matter after the trial. But firstly, let's go through the trial. On day 1, the court heard from family, friends and neighbours of George and Elizabeth, and on day 2 it was medical experts. So, day 1, let's go through briefly what some of the key people said, because despite what George Robertson had done, no one really seemed willing to condemn him. All of the information from day 1 in the trial came from the Edinburgh Evening News on the 1st of June 1954. So, first up was Jean Robertson. Jean's time on the stand was interrupted a number of times while she composed herself after being in tears. She was said to have been slim and wearing a grey suit and a maroon hat. Jean said her mother, her brother and herself were afraid of her father. She told of the steps the family had taken to try and prevent their father getting into the house, such as a chair against the door and a poker close at hand. On cross-examination, Jean was asked if her father had for some time disapproved of her staying out late at night, suggesting that that could have been the cause of the trouble between Jean and her father, but Jean denied this. She was then asked about the allegation she had made when the police came to remove George Sr. from the house in early February, when she said that her father had been having intercourse with her for years, with the defence putting it to her that this allegation had been untrue, and she had only said this as she had been angry with her father, to which Jean replied that it was true, that her father had in fact been having intercourse with her for years. Next up was George's mum, Elsie Robertson. She told the court that when she visited her son in Sutton prison on the Monday after his arrest, he told her that a note had been left for her at her home. She went home and found this message, which was written on the back of a photograph and placed in the drawer of her dressing table. It was dated Saturday, the 27th of February, and it read, "How I miss you all. To my dear mother, I can't say and tell you, but immaterial of what I may do or have done, I love you all with my heart. Give Willie and Stuarty the same. From your ever-loving son, George. P.S. I can't stick it any longer. The allegations and hurts I've had all my days from Liz are more than I can stand, as there is not even one item of truth. She may suffer by all the ways I'm supposed to have treated her." When Elsie was cross-examined regarding her son's mental state, she said that usually he was happy and carefree, but during the fortnight preceding the arrest, while he was living with her, he was very depressed and on the verge of tears several times, going on to say that he was choked with grief over whatever was wrong. She said that when George had gone out on the Saturday, about 7 p.m, the evening of the murders, he had been in tears. Next on the stand was a sister of Elizabeth's. She spoke of an occasion about 3 weeks before her sister died when George Robertson Sr. came to her house, saying he had been looking all over for his ex-wife Elizabeth, and at this time he told her that he was going to blow them all up. Upon cross-examination, Elizabeth's sister said that George Robertson and her sister had had many quarrels, both before and after their divorce, and on several occasions when these occurred, George Robertson had tied her sister's wrists together. She was then asked by the defence, "In his own way, the accused was passionately fond of your sister, wasn't he?" To which Elizabeth's sister replied, "Yes, I think he was, sir," with the defence going on to ask, "And very jealous?" To which she replied, "Yes." Next on the stand was Catherine Hay, the neighbour whose window George Jr. had jumped through. She said that Elizabeth McGarry had told her that George Robertson had threatened to kill her, George Jr. and Jean with a hatchet several times. She then went on to tell the court what had taken place in her flat the night of the murders. When she was cross-examined, she said that on the night of the murders, when George Robertson Sr. was in her home, he made reference to rumours about him that were being put about by his ex-wife Elizabeth and daughter Jean. Next onto the stand was Larry Hay, and he also told the court what had taken place in his flat on the night of the murders, saying that, "I put my hand on his shoulder and tried to speak to him, and he turned round and told me to keep out of it." He stated that when he had helped George Sr. lift George Jr. up from the floor and onto his shoulders, that George Jr. was already dead. Also taking to the stand was the 12-year-old daughter of Larry and Catherine Hay, Margaret, and she told the hushed court how George Robertson Jr. and his father had come into her house, saying that George tried to close the door but fell down. His father stabbed him with a knife. Then I covered up my head and did not see any more. On day 2, it was the turn of the medical professionals and witnesses who could attest to George Robertson's mental state before and at the time of the murders. All of the information from day 2 of the trial also came from the Edinburgh Evening News on the 2nd of June 1954. But interestingly, in the weeks before the trial, when George Sr. was requested to appear in court being committed to trial, he was reported in the Scotsman on the 22nd of May to have been very relaxed and whistling softly to himself on one occasion, and on another occasion he was reported by the Edinburgh Evening News to have apparently left the court with his hands in his trouser pockets and casually sauntered down the stairs to the cells. So, first up on day 2 was 50-year-old Reginald Bailey, who was a consultant psychiatrist at Goulburn Institution in Edinburgh and a lecturer in mental deficiency at Edinburgh University. He said that after examining George Robertson on the 26th of May, he found that the accused was suffering from no mental disease or disorder of the mind whatsoever. When he was cross-examined, Dr. Bailey agreed that his discussion with George showed that he was deeply attached to his wife. Dr. Bailey also told the court how he had discussed the events of the night of the 27th and 28th of February with George Robertson, with George having told Dr. Bailey that he had no recollection of the early hours of the Sunday morning. But Dr. Bailey said, in point of fact, he had a very clear recollection, but that he was so overwhelmed with the horror that he did not want to remember the events of the night or to recall them to his memory. The defence then asked Dr. Bailey, did it strike you as peculiar that he should kill his wife and son, for whom he had considerable affection, and yet not kill his daughter, with whom he had antagonism? To which Dr. Bailey replied, I consider he was so enraged at the time, he was furiously angry and not fully aware of what he was doing. He was horror-stricken with what had happened. When Dr. Bailey was asked if George could have been not responsible for his actions, Dr. Bailey said, that is not my view, but is a view that might be taken. With the cross-examination concluded by the defence, the prosecution then re-examined Dr. Bailey, asking him if George Robertson was not aware of what he was doing, did that necessarily mean that he was suffering from a mental disorder? To which Dr. Bailey replied, not at all. Dr. Bailey did agree, though, that sometimes people got so enraged that they did not know what they were doing. Dr. Bailey was then asked by the prosecution, is there anything in your inquiries that in the early hours of Sunday morning the accused, being a jealous man, being an angry man, worked himself up into a passion and attempted to get his revenge? To which Dr. Bailey replied, that is my view of what happened. Next on the stand was Helen Findlay, who had known George Sr.'s parents for more than 20 years, her sole purpose being to establish that George's apparent loss of control on the night of the murders ran in the family, saying that when George Sr.'s father was in a passion, his face went white and his eyes would flash and stare. Next to attest to George Sr.'s normal disposition and his mental state on the lead-up to the murders was Frances Rouse, who had lived next door to George's parents' home for 18 or 19 years. She stated that she'd gotten to know George over the years, either when he visited his mum or stayed there in between prison sentences, and she said that he was a cheerful and happy type. However, this changed in the fortnight before the tragedy, when she noticed a change in him, saying he seemed worried and did not want to talk, which was unusual and surprising to her. The next expert witness to take to the stand was Dr. William Blythe, who was a psychiatrist at Glasgow Royal Infirmary and a consultant to the South West Scotland Regional Hospital Board. He too had visited George Robertson at Sutton Prison about a week before the trial, and he said, I was of the opinion that he was sane and fit to plead to his actions, but that, in my opinion, there was a condition of diminished responsibility present, and that, in his opinion, after examining George, there was sufficient evidence to render George not fully responsible for his actions. Dr. Blythe then went on to explain the reasoning behind his opinion, firstly giving a bit of George's family history and background, saying that George Sr.'s father had been an unstable type of man, that there was a history of 2 of George Sr.'s cousins having been in a mental hospital, and of another cousin showing a marked degree of mental instability. He also stated that there was a family history showing neuropathic inheritance to mental disease. When Dr. Blythe spoke of the night of the murders, his only explanation was that George Robertson had had an acute brainstorm, and that on the night of the tragedy, the balance of George's mind was disturbed. He stated that George was clearly paranoid about his daughter, and that George was of the opinion that she was the root of most of his marital unhappiness, that she was trying to come between himself and his ex-wife Elizabeth. Due to this, Dr. Blythe would have expected George to have killed his daughter and not his son, to whom he was devoted. Dr. Blythe continued by stating that the fact George Robertson wished to hang was another indication of abnormality, along with the fact that George stated that he had had to tie his ex-wife's wrists, cover her mouth with adhesive, and threaten her with a hatchet in order to be able to reason with her, with Dr. Blythe stating this was definitely a sign of abnormality. Dr. Blythe was then cross-examined and admitted that his opinion rested entirely on what George Robertson had told him, including the fact that he believed George had a mental disease, in that he suffered delusions of persecution, believing that for the last 20 years he had been persecuted by his wife's family. Dr. Blythe was then asked by the defence if there was anything inconsistent with this crime having been committed by a jealous and angry man working himself up into a rage, to which Dr. Blythe stated that there was, going on to say, firstly, I think that his general conduct in carrying upstairs 2 people whom he had killed is not consistent with a man in a rage. Secondly, his attitude in tying and gagging his wife before he stabbed her and stabbing his daughter before he tied her cannot be accounted for purely on the grounds of rage. Thirdly, his statement that he was more interested in making sure that his daughter didn't disturb him while he was committing suicide, I don't think that these factors are to be accounted for by rage alone. Dr. Blythe then stated that, in his opinion, George had been fully responsible for his actions since he was about 31 years old. Following cross-examination, Dr. Blythe was then re-examined again by the prosecution, who asked him to describe further his interaction with George Robertson, to which Dr. Blythe replied, "The prisoner was very truthful, but exceedingly unhelpful. In fact, he was apologetic in being unable to produce symptoms, and he appeared to be more concerned with the fact that one should not diagnose him as insane. He considered that hanging would be a lesser slur to his character than a diagnosis of insanity." The next and final expert to take to the stand was Sir David Kennedy Henderson, who was a professor of psychiatry at Edinburgh University. Sir David had examined George 3 times, on the 2nd of March, the 9th of March, and the 27th of May, and he stated that he found no trace of mental unsoundness. When he was asked if George had presented with any peculiarity of mind, Sir David said he had not. He was then asked if he had been aware that whilst being held at Sutton Prison, George had tried to obtain phenobarbital tablets to commit suicide, to which Sir David said that the matter had been reported to him. He was then asked, "Did you know that he assaulted a warden who was not connected in any way with his frustration in the attempt to get these tablets?" To which Sir David replied slowly that, "I was not aware of that." Moving on, the defence then asked Sir David, "Did he tell you that he wished to hang?" To which Sir David replied that George had indicated that he realised the very great seriousness of the position in which he was placed. It was then put to Sir David by the defence that, in his opinion, did he believe on the night of the incident George had had an acute brainstorm, and that at the time he committed these assaults he was not responsible for his actions. To which Sir David said he would have liked to have come to that conclusion, but he was very sorry he was unable to. And just like that, the trial was over after 2 days. The closing speeches took place, with the defence asking the jury to return a verdict of culpable homicide on the grounds that George Robertson, at the time of the stabbings, was not fully responsible for his actions, that there had been evidence of mental instability in the Robertson family, and that there had been no premeditation shown, and the prosecution saying to the jury that George Alexander Robertson should be found guilty of murder, as there was no diminished responsibility in this case, but obvious premeditation, saying that the 2 knives used had never been seen in the house before. You don't go out for a friendly discussion with your late wife and your son and daughter armed to the teeth with 2 knives. Then Judge Lord Thompson, the presiding judge, summed up. Before the jury of 9 men and 6 women retired for only an hour before they were back to deliver their verdict. George Alexander Robertson was found unanimously guilty of murder in relation to his former wife, Elizabeth McGarry, and son, 18-year-old George Robertson Jr., but not guilty for the attempted murder in relation to his daughter Jean. Instead, he was found guilty in relation to Jean of stabbing her, causing her severe injury and danger of life. Judge Lord Thompson then reached for the black cap before sentencing 40-year-old George Alexander Robertson to death by hanging, with the execution date being set for the 23rd of June 1954. After George had been found guilty and his sentence to death by hanging had been passed, he then asked the judge if he could speak, to which the judge agreed, and George addressed the court with his carefully prepared speech. "Firstly, for the sake of my wife's family, I would like to say one thing. Certain interpretation has been made by the doctors. Of course it's not the doctors' fault, but they say I had a state of enmity towards them. I may have at times, when they took her part, felt bitter towards them, but personally I like my wife's family. It could have saved a lot of misery if, under the Scottish Act, Section 31, which gives a prisoner an opportunity to plead guilty to crimes, known or unknown to the police, I took advantage of this when I heard I was charged only with murder. I took advantage of this to forward a letter to the department asking them to accept the plea to save any more grief to our family and my own and my mother's. I think it's only right, if you can in any way help a man in my position again, that he may have an opportunity to plead guilty. That is all. However, according to an article in the Edinburgh Evening News on the 3rd of June 1954, a plea of guilty is never accepted to a charge of murder due to the common law and practices of Scotland. It is too big an onus to put on one man. So regardless of the pain a trial would put everyone through, and regardless of the fact that medical professionals would be digging into not only George's past medical and mental history, but also that of his family's, a trial must be carried out. George Robertson was then led from the court and taken to Sutton Prison to await his execution day. Now, George did appeal the death sentence, appealing to the Secretary of State for a reprieve. However, on the 22nd of June, the day before the execution, George Robertson received the news, according to the Scotsman on the 22nd of June 1954, that the Secretary of State regretted that after careful consideration he was unable to find sufficient grounds to justify him in advising Her Majesty to interfere with the due course of the law. And so, 40-year-old George Alexander Robertson was executed at Sutton Prison on Wednesday the 23rd of June, shortly after 8 a.m, with only a few people, mainly men, standing outside the prison waiting for the notice of execution to be pinned on the glass-fronted notice board. Interestingly, it was reported that Jean Robertson had visited her father at Sutton Prison 2 days before his execution day, at which point she supposedly forgave him. Or did she?
I don't know if Dean did ever forgive him. I would find that very hard to forgive somebody that killed my mother and my brother.
As Stephen said, he's done a lot of research over the years about this case. This is what he's found out about what happened to Jean after the murder.
I've done my family history for years, and I started looking where she went. I found out where she went when she died and whatnot. She went to New Zealand with Dorothy's mother, her granny, her dad's side. I think she died in 92, 2002. She died over there, but I don't know if she ever got married again. If she ever got married, if she had children, I don't know. I don't know if this podcast goes out, how far the audience goes over worldwide, and if somebody would know. It was in Auckland, New Zealand, she moved there.
So if anyone is listening and knows what happened to Jean Robertson after she left Scotland and moved to New Zealand, or if she had children and her children are listening, please contact the podcast and let me know so I can pass the information on to Stephen. It would mean a lot to him and his Aunt Jessie. Before we end, here's Stephen's final thoughts on the case, and he also mentions something about someone present at George's execution that I found quite interesting.
He wanted Scottish law changed, if you like. It's like you become a caring father again. I didn't want to put my family through this. I've just murdered 2 of them. When I read that, when I started researching it, 40 witnesses in 2 days, that's quite a lot of people to get through in 2 days. He pleaded guilty, and the jury was only out for an hour. He would have pleaded guilty to that as well, the attempted murder. But this is what I was saying as well. See, Scottish law at the time, if you were sentenced to death, the person that you first appeared in front of, he must be at your execution. Now, one of the bailies, there was 2 of them, and the bailies, they're just like Justice of the Peace now. And one of them name was Keane, and one was Cabs, Cabas. One of them become a campaigner to abolish the death penalty because they didn't like what they had saw and saw when they got executed. But in the paper, they say everything went fantastic, well done, everybody. But one of them hated what he saw, and he became a campaigner to abolish the death penalty in the 60s. Was it 66 he got abolished? Aye, the 60s, I think it was. Aye, so it'd be quite interesting to find out a bit more about the guy that became a campaigner to abolish the death penalty. Could you imagine just going in there? Because I think that where they hung them in Sopton, it was just a double cell. I think it was 2 cells knocked into one and just a trapdoor put in it. And I do believe the gallows, they ended up they were meant to go to a jail in Stirling, in a museum. But they've still got them, but they couldn't put them up because it must be a low roof building. But they've still got the gallows they sought in prison in a museum or a jail in Stirling, where I think I had read about. 34 people were hanged in Scotland in the 20th century, 12 in Duke Street in Glasgow, 10 in Berlin, 3 in Carlton Prison in Edinburgh, 4 took place in Saughton, 3 in Perth, 1 in Aberdeen, that was the last one, and 1 took place in Inverness. I think there was only 1 woman hung in that time. But you wonder, even people say this now, Don Guinness, yeah, bastard should be hung in that. And you're going, how many people would have been in since the 60s when it got abolished to this day? How many more people would have been hung, eh? When I was reading into it, there was 200 crimes you could be hanged for in Scotland. But what happened was a lot of people used to get sent to the colonies or Australia or whatnot, eh? But for some reason on this time, the judge went, nah, you're getting hung, eh? So the court records, they're not available for another 5 years. And we get them, I think you've got a bigger and better picture. He's pleaded guilty to the murders, obviously, he's got to go to trial. But he must have pled guilty to attempted murder of his daughter. And the jury, for some reason, I never tried to murder his daughter, he just seriously assaulted his daughter, came to a severe injury, and you're like, but he's admitted it. With their records, I think it'd be interesting, but I'll come back to what I says. 40 witnesses in 2 days, I think that's a hell of a lot. And that's, back then, I don't think they would have sat any longer, but how they go through it, especially the ones like the doctors and that are coming in that are saying you think that would have took a lengthy time. Suppose when you've got to put somebody to death, and it's, I think they've got to say that they've done it right. Getting back on to George, and he would have got all that advice as well. And when you read everything that you got, that you never try to play the game, saying I'm off my head and whatnot, and I was hearing voices and whatnot, I was drunk, and never tried anything, it's just went, take mate. I don't know if you've ever seen the film, Pierpont. It's quite a good film, but he executed over 600 people. He was saying that for everybody that he killed, he didn't think it stopped anybody else from killing anybody.
The death penalty in Scotland was abolished in 1965, and the film Stephen mentioned was called Pierpont, which is a 2005 British film loosely based on the life of Britain's most prolific hangman, Albert Pierpont, played by Timothy Spall. So, what do you think about this case? Do you agree with what Stephen says, or do you think something else? You can contact me on social media or email me at contact@scottishmurders.com. And again, if anyone knows what happened to Jean Robertson after she left Scotland, or if you knew the Hayes, then please get in touch. So that's almost the end of the episode, but I'm going to leave you with Stephen's last words, which I found quite chilling, but also spot on.
It's no just, everybody thinks Edinburgh is wonderful, this, what a lovely city and whatnot. There's a deep, deep, dark past.
Scottish Murders is a production of Tron.